Hello and welcome to Energy Bridge Africa. It is the link to powering the continent with myself, Fifi Peters. In last week's episode, we looked at all things finance, zeroing in on where the money is flowing, where the gaps still lie, and what it will truly take to fund a sustainable and self-sufficient energy sector for Africa. Today's episode is not too far from that. We are looking at what the right energy mix for the continent is. And it is a question at the heart of every power cut, every stalled factory, and every policy debate. In Kenya, wind turbines spin across the Lake Turkana Plains. In Mozambique, vast gas reserves promise industrial growth. And here in South Africa, coal still dominates, even as solar and wind farms emerge on the horizon. So how do we strike the right balance between the old fuels and the new ones, between economic necessity and environmental responsibility? Joining me for this conversation is Shirley Weber, Managing Principal, Coverage Head, Resources and Energy at Absa CIB, and Prof. Harro von Blotnitz, Director, Energy Systems Research Group, Chemical Engineering Department over at the University of Cape Town. To the both of you, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. The basics, the right energy mix for the African context right now, in terms of this transition to zero, in your view, what does that look like?
Thanks, Fifi. For financial institutions, we definitely have to look at a carbon neutral transition going forward. What does it actually mean? The transition means it must be phased in because there's consequences if it happens too fast. Hence the just part of just transition. So we believe that there will always be alternative energy sources going forward, and we must never forget that we all need baseload. And what does it actually mean then for the African continent? Baseload would mean we have coal, for example, in South Africa, and it can't just all disappear, but we have to build the renewable parts to it. And that's why the solar and the wind that we've been building over the last 10, 11, 12 years is very good for the country. If you move to Africa, there's an enormous amount of resources in gas, in natural gas. So that should definitely be harnessed for the economies and for the economic growth of so many countries to ensure that baseload for them could possibly be gas to power, whilst renewables are also built in the process.
I hear you, except in the previous episode that we hosted, we heard that there are some financial institutions right now that are not putting new money into some of the baseload resources such as coal, rather positioning themselves to focus on the future energy sources such as renewables. And I know that this is a hotly contested debate. And so, Prof, I'd like to bring you in and also get your thoughts on what a just energy transition and the right energy mix looks like in the African context, and how, for instance, it compares to what's happening in the global north.
Thank you very much. A transition, I think, can only happen if you already have a lot of energy and it's the wrong type of energy in relation to what your context demands. So this is relevant for South Africa, and it's relevant for some of the countries in North Africa to an extent as well. But for much of Africa, it's really a matter of an energy addition to the national systems. And we also should refrain from finding a single answer to what the right mix is. As the saying goes, Africa is not a country. And even within some of the countries, they're very large with very different resource endowments and very different energy demand profiles. So it is place specific, it is country specific.
Okay, I hear you, and a good point to also not paint the continent with one brush. There's different situations, and we're at different levels of economic development as a continent at large as well. But surely, in essence, you were just talking about a little bit of everything towards progressing to a lot more of the cleaner and the more carbon neutral fuels in future. But if we then look at that path of transition, as it were, and progression, taking into context what the Prof said about, it's not a one size fits all, but given the urgency to industrialize, what elements, and I don't know if this is an unfair question to ask you, but in what portions, should the energy mix be balanced in right now? I mean, if you had a basket of all these energy sources right now, what portion would you give, for instance, solar? What portion would you give to wind? What portion would you give to things like coal and even gas right now? Or is that an unfair question?
I think it's an unfair question because it's being built as we speak. But very happy to answer the question in the way that we know South Africa was obviously very dependent and still is on coal generation to power. But clearly we've seen, in the region of, if you look at the RP 2019, the 2023 one, the 2024 one, that there will be a gradual phase out of many of the coal-fired power plants. And that would mean that renewables must be built. If I look at what we put on the table from an additional 30, close to 30 gigawatts that should be put onto the table from a renewables point of view, we have succeeded, say, in a third of that. That was added. But as the Prof mentioned, it was not necessarily in addition to, but it was actually a replacement of many coal-fired power plants that wasn't working. So we've got a long way to go in South Africa. I think we've over the last 12 years with the IPP office building up REAP as well as the battery storage, which is actually quite important, as well as a possible gas to power initiative or program that's going to come in. We can see there will be a shift, but again, it becomes the just transition. Where will we be in 10 years' time? I think it becomes that question. Coal will be there, and maybe we're talking about 40% coal to power. Maybe then we're sitting with at least another 30 to 40% renewables, more sun than wind, because of the grid capacity that we're lacking. And maybe the battery storage will play a 10% role ultimately. Sure. So I see that mix happening. But this is it's a medium to longer term view, not short term.
Exactly. And also based on, which country we're talking about and what their natural deposits are right now. Prof, perhaps maybe to put things differently to you in the very important point that you make of, not painting the continent with one brush. But maybe judging from what you have seen in terms of how certain countries are trying to go about transitioning on the continent from your more developed and your more industrialized economies like the South Africas and the Nigerias, for instance, to perhaps the smaller economies, as it were. What is your assessment of what that energy mix looks like right now? And is there any recommendations that you could provide at a continental level?
It's always important when we ask that question of the energy mix, whether we're really talking about the full energy system or just the electricity system. Electricity systems across much of the continent are very small. Even Nigeria has an electricity system 1/3 the size of South Africa, but it's got 200 million people upwards versus 60 million here. So, we see that a typical Nigerian has only 5% of the electricity that a South African could get. So in the electricity mixes, we see a lot of hydropower, and that's still there for the larger plants. But the modular addition of solar power is the one that's currently the easiest to do. Even countries with good wind resources would, for example, struggle to get the big turbine blades to the places where they might want to build the wind turbines, simply because the road infrastructure might not be there. We have looked at this in the context of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there is a good wind resource. And then beyond electricity, of course, the energy mix. What do we mean by energy? It's how the vehicles move, and that's petrol and diesel, and how the airplanes fly, and how do people cook their meals, and that very often outside the big cities is still biomass or charcoal, and those situations really need attention as well.
I mean, I think that we haven't even mentioned the source of energy of nuclear as yet in the discussion, and there are a lot of countries that are going towards that direction, South Africa being a case in point. But I would like to get your initial thoughts on a new energy entity in the South African context, the South African National Petroleum Company that has been tasked to do quite a bit of things. It's been tasked to ensure that we are more resilient independently when it comes to oil production in this country as well as gas. Your take on this SANPC entity, and perhaps more importantly, relevant for this conversation, the role that national petroleum companies will play in leading or even adapting to the energy transition?
I think it's a question to be answered possibly in the following way. A national petroleum company have got a responsibility to look after the energy needs for the country, but it can't be done in isolation. Clearly, we've got our electricity department, we've got Eskom under that, but then we also have, for example, the DMR, where all the intensive mining users, for example, is sitting. So it cannot be done in isolation, any strategic objective of the National Petroleum Company. If I look at petroleum, and let's just be honest, we had many refineries in South Africa, and we have now one extra one on the continent in Nigeria. The need for petroleum coming into the country versus the need for oil coming into the country, there's definitely a shift in balance because we need more petroleum coming in because South Africa has got 2 refineries that's up and running, and they're doing well. But now with oil, where does it go? And obviously storage becomes another capacity. So that's also a question. With the alternative energy sources, we still believe that on electricity generation, the renewables, etc., all make sense with our Minister of Electricity obviously driving it, with many areas giving input into that to make sure that we live up to what the IRPs give us to do. On the petroleum side, like I've mentioned, are we okay as a country just to have 2 refineries? And do we have enough storage capacity, infrastructure? And the Prof mentioned there's a lot of infrastructure gaps that we have. The storage of petroleum, the storage of natural gas, if we want to get the gas to power up and running, as well as the grid capacity, transmission and distribution, etc. So there's so many parts that's so interconnected. The National Petroleum Company can only be successful if it works in collaboration with so many other departments, and everyone's got a role to play, and we just need to make sure it's coherent and everyone knows what the end goal is.
Sure, which has been their stated intention, their intention to partner and collaborate with industry stakeholders. It's a new entity, and of course we'll see the extent to which that partnership does materialize. But I would, Prof, to bring you in, I would say no to one of the questions that Shirley posed, to say that are we okay as a country to just have 2 refineries? And the answer is no. And one of the objectives that the SANPC has right now is trying to see how to get the other refineries back on track. It's going to be a huge task. Nonetheless, they seem to be up to it. So it's one of the newest companies. I mean, it was conceived initially back in 2020. The idea was to have it up and running in 6 months. It clearly took a lot longer, and it only came to market this year, in the month of May. Nonetheless, spoken to a few of the team, and they are ready to hit the ground running, as it were, and achieve their mandate in oil and gas, but also on the renewable component element of it. Just your thoughts on their the sort of success factor, or potential success factor, perhaps, is the more accurate way to put it.
Yeah, the question of whether we should see a state-owned company trying to build an oil refinery as the oil age draws slowly to a close is not a trivial one. In our energy systems model that we run, that represents South Africa's energy system, we do not see a rational case for such a large public investment. our oil refineries here are very small relative to the rest of the world. There is an overcapacity in many other countries, which means refined product is easily available. It's always an important question whether you try to add some value domestically or whether you go and get the inputs to your economy cheaply on a competitive world market. So I'll leave it there. We've not specifically looked at the mandates and the work of the National Petroleum Company beyond representing the question of oil refining or not in our national energy systems model.
All right, so maybe to put it differently, Shirley, in the event that success is achieved in this new model, and you've got these revenues coming in from oil, and you've got these higher revenues than is presently the case coming in from gas, what role do you reckon that such revenues could play if reinvested to fund our renewable ambitions? And do you think that this should be the strategic thinking and direction, not only of the SANPC, but perhaps other national oil companies on the continent that have similar mandates?
I think every country has got different mandates. In many of our dealings with many of the national oil companies on the continent, we've seen, hardly any refineries, under the auspices of a national oil company, sure, except obviously Nigeria, but it's privately owned, as we know. When we look at, many of the East African countries, many of the national oil companies also have distribution parts linked to it. In other words, the forecourts where you and I would put in petrol, etc., that form part of many of the national oil companies' ambit as well. So storage, also in many of the African countries, is mostly government-owned and some private-owned, etc. While in South Africa, except for our strategic fuel areas where we kept oil, many of the storage capacity is privately owned, because it does take an enormous amount of money to put it up, to obviously make sure it's maintained, etc., and to have that terminal import capacities up and running. So we appreciate that. So what is a success for a national oil company? To ensure that the energy use for any country should be reasonable and efficient and cost efficient for us, the user. And it brings back to the question or the answer from Prof to say that, is another oil refinery actually the better option or not? Maybe it becomes, should it be not be a storage facility that's being put up, whilst we know that internal combustion engines will continue as we get access to electricity. Maybe that becomes the question. Maybe storage is better than putting up a new refinery, because what is the intention of a just transition? We need to move, although baseload will always be there, to more renewable sources. And renewable sources can be cleaner, because you know as well that gas to power is 50% less emissions if the technology is used right compared to coal to power. So for me, that's the question, making sure that we do things that's efficient, not just for the owner, the national oil company, but also for the people on the ground.
Okay. Actually bringing it back and taking a step back or to the beginning of the discussion in terms of the broader just energy path for the continent. Prof, I mean, you would also know that quite a number of countries being signatories to the Paris Climate Accord and having made their own nationally determined commitments and targets towards the path to net zero, but also being pressured in some part by some international standards and international timelines to do or to meet respective international goals. I mean, if I just give an example of what's happening in the auto sector right now and some of the regulation governing the auto sector and the kind of cars that will be allowed in Europe, for instance, come 2030. I'd just like your thoughts on a point that Shirley made about ensuring that we don't go too fast in this just transition, but of course that we don't go too slow. What do you make of the global suggested pace, as it were? And do you think that there is a risk of countries in Africa being asked to do too much too soon?
Difficult question. in these big sectors, one needs to see what the big corporations do. There are 10 big motor manufacturing corporations. Some of them are bigger than many countries in Africa in terms of the money they handle. And so one needs to really look at what they do and what pace they move, rather than asking what are African countries being asked to do in relation to climate change. The point of a nationally determined contribution is that it should be one that is determined by the nation in relation to its particular development goals and to the reading of the policymakers and decision makers in the country as to what they can or cannot do. But the interplay of the country with the big technology complexes in the world is always one that is outside the control of the national decision makers in many ways. So having good intelligence as to what is happening on the markets is important.
Or perhaps maybe, Prof, put more simply, with the growing needs on the continent still for basic access to power and electricity, and also power to industrialize, how does Africa balance this need with the growing need also globally to lower carbon emissions? Do you reckon such a balance is possible at all?
The request in that sense would be to add the power that Africa needs without unduly adding to the global greenhouse gas burden. And there one just has to see what in each particular situations are the trade-offs that countries face. And unfortunately, we're talking about electricity. The cheapest way these days to get electricity is low carbon. And many countries on the continent actually don't have the coal that would be the big problem anyway. They do have the hydroelectric resources. They do have the solar resource. So, in terms of electricity, I'm not seeing a contradiction here.
So Shirley, you spoke about the technologies at the start that would be needed to power this the transition, I suppose, even the leapfrogging into this new energy world, as it were. But I also want to know, realistically, with these renewables, can Africa realistically leapfrog into this space? And also, what are the potential implications for communities who are very much heavily dependent on the old energy sources?
I think there's a big opportunity for Africa to do that, moving forward to cleaner energy, but it must be done in a matter of phasing in the process, the approach. For example, the Prof mentioned that charcoal and biomass is still used for cooking. We've seen many initiatives in many African countries that we visit on a regular basis that LPG is becoming a very big import fuel.
Sure.
So that's very important. And that makes cleaner cooking, which is better for the environment, etc. But that's first phase in many of the countries. If I look at the stumbling block currently to move to cleaner energy in many of our African countries, where we initially had it as well as a South African, as a country, was the stability and of, for example, the grid, and we still need to build in South Africa, but the grid availability on the rest of the continent, but also the regulations around, energy and how it moves. We all know that we need to appreciate that we need stable, profitable, local utilities, where if the local utility is financially stable, that more funding could be given where the utility is the off-taker. That's the first point. That utility then could get a lot more projects up and running. But apart from that, their regulations to decentralize, like we did in South Africa, up to 100 megawatts, for example, that we initially had, where the intensive users can be using more that. So that would mean whatever electricity power or electricity form was in the country. Let's use Zambia. Hydropower is quite big there. Kenya, hydro is quite big there. But that's so that whatever is available can be used for communities, and where intensive users like mining could use their own, for example, regulated, allocation. So I think that's quite important. What we are missing, I think, on the African continent, the just transition, it's happening. The transition is going to be slow up to a point, and it's going to happen fast. The African countries need to prepare themselves to look what can be done in the value chain. We've got so many minerals and metals that's used in that transition. But we take the ore out of the ground and we ship it off, literally. So what we need to do is we need to do some processing there, because it's just going to come back in one or other renewable solar panel, etc. So I think that's the opportunity. But not just the inputs from a mining point of view, but also the inputs. Why don't we build, a certain factory or plant that generates solar panels, and that should be a very big focus of the economies. The community then gets new skills, they get access to better value chains. That all helps for the economic growth in the countries. Those are the things that we should be doing, knowing that this transition is happening as we speak.
And they get jobs, which perhaps allay some of the fears in certain communities that are dependent on the old energy forms. So I do hear that argument. But we are going to have to leave it there. And thanks once again for your participation, helping us wrap up Energy Bridge Africa for today. Shirley Weber, Managing Principal, Coverage Head, Resources and Energy at ABSA CIB, as well as Prof. Harro von Plotznitz, the Professor for Engineer, Director, Energy Systems Research Group, Chemical Engineering Department, the University of Cape Town. From us, from our Johannesburg headquarters, it is goodbye for now, and we'll catch you on the next one.